Hi, my name is Bethany Brewer, and this is my Action Research Project. The purpose of this study is to determine the effect of using kinesthetic movement during distributed vocabulary practice on student retention and engagement. My second grade students were the participants in this study. Hand gestures and body movements were utilized during vocabulary practice. After 4 days of distributed kinesthetic practice, a test was given for determining the meaning of vocabulary words and compared to student scores before using kinesthetic movement during practice. Student engagement during practice was measured by my daily observation notes. The results of this study showed that using kinesthetic movement during vocabulary practice increased retention and improved student engagement. Anyone who has been in a second grade classroom knows that children were not meant to sit still all day long. Recess and PE are not sufficient movement breaks to keep the kids going. In my district, there is a new curriculum used for reading called Journeys. I believe it is a great curriculum, and it gives students age-appropriate texts with which they can interact often. One important piece of this new curriculum is daily vocabulary study. I began noticing that my students were not retaining the vocabulary words and their meanings as well as I believed they should. Students were not actively engaged in our practice time while taking notes and doing practice sheets. What could I do to improve their retention? How could I get them more actively engaged? These questions and problems led me to my decision to incorporate kinesthetic movement into my daily vocabulary practice. My goal for this study was to improve student vocabulary acquisition and their engagement during practice. The participants for my study were 12 of my 14 students. 2 of my students were not included in this study as they received special education pull-out services during reading instruction for the entire core time. This was a single measurement design study as I introduced a strategy and attempted to measure its impact. In changing my vocabulary practice procedure for this study, I kept our original routine intact and simply added kinesthetic movement to it. This meant that on Mondays, I would introduce the words and give students an opportunity to say the words aloud with their definitions. I would ask them a prompt to discuss with their partner to help them build connection with the word, and then we would come up with a gesture that made sense to the students to model the meaning of the word. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, we would practice our gestures and then take notes on the words, definitions, and some visual representations of each of our words. Thursdays, students would practice the gestures and then complete a practice sheet. Fridays, we would get up and practice the gestures before taking our test. After these days of practice, the students took an 8-question matching test for the words and their definitions. After each day of practice, I also filled out a scale of how engaged the students were that day. In order to analyze the quantitative impact of this strategy, I compared one vocabulary test from before I began implementing the strategy to 2 tests given after implementing the strategy. I collected this data by giving the 8-point matching test and grading the results. I compiled the results into a chart and then used that chart to create a bar graph. The bar graph shows on the x-axis each student in my study, and the y-axis shows how many questions they got out of 8. The key shows which test goes along with which color of bar. For the qualitative data, I completed a quick check of student engagement with a 1 to 5 rating. 1 describing the students generally disengaged, and 5 describing the children as actively engaged. I completed this check daily after each vocabulary practice session. Each week is noted there with averages at the bottom. The results of this study show that incorporating kinesthetic movement into distributed vocabulary instruction positively impacts word retention as well as active engagement. The student test scores increased from an average of 5.5 correct out of 8 to 7.8 correct out of 8. The engagement survey I filled out daily showed an increase from an average of 75% of students disengaged before the strategy was applied to an average of between 75 and 100% of students actively engaged as a result of the strategy being applied. I based this on their enthusiasm and energy in completing tasks. I didn't just base it on completion because all students complete all assignments that I assign in my class. So I needed to base it on more than just them completing the task. Both the quantitative and qualitative data showed an increase as a result of this short study. I believe that this strategy would benefit all teachers. It could be used in multiple aspects of instruction, not just reading vocabulary. Gestures can be used to convey meaning in math and science vocabulary as well. Non-instructional movement could also be incorporated into lessons to allow students appropriate time for movement in order to minimize those inappropriate or distracting movements. I believe that sharing this strategy with other teachers in the future would benefit student learning. It would also allow me to hear additional strategies from good teachers to improve this strategy in my practice in the future. Thank you.